Good afternoon, my name is Sebastián Arcos, I'm the Associate Director, and I'm going to be moderating the Q&A session. Please raise your hand to ask a question. Tell us your name and let us know if you're directing the question to a specific panelist or for the entire panel. We can take several questions for the next 20 minutes. Question in the back.
Yes, my name is Antolin Carbonell. I've been in Cienfuegos several times, and in the cathedral a few years ago they took some stucco off a column and they found Chinese inscriptions on the bricks. Does anyone know anything about that?
I'm sorry. Oh, okay, maybe I'll just shout though. Our colleague Mitzi Espinosa Luis, who got to travel to China with Professor Lopez, she's actually from Cienfuegos, and she was a historian and an archivist there, and she was one of the people that discovered those items. And one of the things that she found within one of these blockaded rooms was elements of Chinese healing, so of herbalism, and also within Cienfuegos was a calendar. She found a calendar of Chinese events, and one of them was for December the 17th, which is also for San Lazo, showing this deity of Isuan. So we can probably provide some more information once we speak to Mitzi on her, but she was instrumental in those findings.
Yeah, I should add too that because of people like Mitzi, who is a descendant of a Chinese Cuban, but also was trained as an archivist and a librarian, there's renewed interest, not only in Havana, but in the provinces, in recovering this history. And so there is hope that things like that will be preserved.
Yes, thank you all for coming. My name is Lucas Katz. I was wondering if there's been any literary output from either within the community or from without, maybe in the last 8 to 10 years. And I say 8 to 10 years specifically because I'm working my way through Lopez Calvo's book, and that was published in 2008. So I wonder if anything's being produced.
Yeah, so one of them that I'm familiar with is, and I don't think this is in Lopez Calvo's book, but El Equipaje Amarillo, Marta Rojas, I believe is the author. And it's a novel, it's fiction about this, the passage that Jose described, and kind of tracing the journeys from the 19th century onward. There's also a lot of unpublished literary production, and a lot of people are now trying to put down their stories, and it's written in Spanish, but it's kind of on loose manuscript pages, some of it handwritten. And so I think it's up to people to try to find this and find ways to get this published, produced, and hopefully translated. And there's probably a lot more that I'm not even familiar with, but because of this interest that always has been there, but now there's kind of openings to get the stuff circulated.
My question is for Maria. It's good to see you. My neighbor from back home in Jersey City. I'm shocked and happy. I have your work is amazing. I love photography. I think it's an important element of any type of research, actually. I'm thinking of how to incorporate it into my own. From our neighborhood, and thinking about the Chinese community there, my great-grandmother was in the late 40s and early 50s responsible for bringing that community into Union City. And I don't know if you remember the Canton restaurant, Maria, the woman that owned it. Maybe your dad does. I mean, this is like going back, way back. And there's still remnants of it. I wonder if you've thought about like maybe walking up on Summit Avenue and taking pictures of what's there still.
I have thought about it just recently, as I've been interacting more with the community that's left in our neighborhood in Union City. And to me, it's striking to hear the stories, I was just younger, but it's striking to hear stories of not only the ones that are there, the original Chinese that came, if they're still alive. The neighbors the stories are great of all the neighbors that either frequented these restaurants or knew these people. And to me, that's becoming more of a story and of a history that I'd like to explore and actually try to either write about it or definitely photograph it. As you know, we really don't have any more of the restaurants, they're gone. And hoping to find some of the remaining Cuban Chinese is difficult if they stayed in touch with each other. And I think that's where I'm at right now, but I would love to see that, especially since we always see the concentration of research as far as the Chinese Cubans is really New York, and it's true because they were there in the 70s, they had the restaurants, it was just more prominent. But Union City and New Jersey just had such a large Cuban population, and they also had Chinese Cubans there, and I think it's overlooked, and it would be great to finally have that history out.
Are you anyone of you familiar with in la calle Sanas, Teatro Shanghai, Shanghai Theater? The origin, the history, why it was created, who did it? There is to way back. It used to be a theater
Yes.
in la calle Sanas. I went when I was a teenager. It was very fun. You had the Chinese guy, Chino Wong, you had the black guy, you had one different individuals that will contribute to the culture of Cuba. And I called Teatro Shanghai. That goes back a long way.
There is an online documentary too about Cantonese Chinese, opera singer, or Caridad Armenteros, that she's Cuban born, not of Chinese descent, but she was raised by a Chinese Cuban, and she learned to sing opera, read and read in Cantonese. And I know that she may have performed there, but to the actual history of why it obviously...
Why it was created, no, it goes back to like 80, 100 years, whatever. I don't know, oh, great, but...
So there's also, this leads to the other question too about literary and historical production in Cuba. There's an amateur historian of the Chinese community in Cuba named Pedro N. Herrera, and he's still alive. He lives in Guanabacoa, and he published a book that was not formally published in Cuba, but it was then translated by Greg Benton and published in 2010, I believe, and so it's in English. But in that book, he recounts the history of a lot of cultural institutions, including that theater. So there might be more a snippet of information.
No, voy a decir una cosa en español. Yo estoy muy orgulloso de cuando era un niño y fui creciendo con la cultura china. Había a dos media cuadras de mi casa una guardería china. Era plancha de hierro, los chinitos cantando en chino, muy felices. En otra esquina, un lugar de frutas chinas y hacía helado, un orejón, un helado muy rico. Así que tengo un buen recuerdo de mi niñez de la comunidad china y casi todos estaban casados con cubanas, se integraron muy bien, gente muy trabajadora, muy honesta, muy honesta, muy buena, muy buena. Hace muchos años de eso, ¿no?
Y tiene la historia también.
In the back.
Yeah, I have a question. Are you aware of, like in Cuba, if there are any Cubans who have Chinese descent that are interested in connecting with their ancestors, but maybe they don't have the resources, or are you aware that there's anything done about it, or?
Well, yes, throughout the years, since I've been researching over a decade in Cuba, and even in Cienfuegos, in the provincial archive, almost on a weekly basis, young people would come in to start to trace their family history. They always started with the archive and the libraries. Other times people would come in with letters and say, oh, I heard that you helped to reconnect Mitzi Espinosa's family, the two sides of the family, and they would come in with their letters. And at times I would realize who they thought was a distant relative was actually siblings that they had, just by reading through the letters. And at the time, the problem was exactly resources. Not only being able to get the permission to leave the country, but the funding to go, and even knowing where to begin. So I think with the increased, not only the reforms in Cuba, but the increased relationship and ties between China and Cuba, the Chinese government is actually helping to sponsor some of these trips, especially for young people that want to learn Chinese and spend a semester abroad. So those kinds of educational exchanges.
You find also that in Chinatown in Havana that many people take up martial arts and learn Chinese, and many have the hope of going to China even for a cultural exchange, and many do.
¿Tú learn Cantonese or
Mandarin.
Mandarin?
Ahora, Mandarin.
Used to be Cantonese.
Cantonese, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm David Dayton. You mentioned a number of state and corporate interests as well as education, foreign exchange is coming back into Cuba, particularly from China, students that are studying there. I wonder if you know about any of the communities that those people are developing or what's developing around those people. Is there a Chinese expat community now in Cuba? Are there foreign exchange students that are staying or returning back to Cuba and living there? We're talking a lot about the ancestry, and people looking for their roots outside of China, or anybody from China coming back in to Cuba.
And let me preface this by saying that in, I think, around 2007, 150 student visas were granted for Chinese to go to Cuba. By 2011, it was in the thousands. By 2012, it was 10,000 Chinese students going to Cuba. Within Cuba, there are representative offices also of Chinese businesses, and that the way that Chinese business happens in Cuba is not the same as European, Spanish, or Canadian investment. The Chinese have adopted a model because of their 5 principles of socialism to first equip, as in, if you need bicycles, we'll send over 1,000, 5,000 bicycles, but then we will set up a bicycle factory within Cuba so you become self-sufficient, which Canadians and Spanish investors are not doing. So as to the impact of Chinese staying, perhaps, I don't know, but the investment is so intense, and that the skill set that the Chinese are building in Cuba among Cubans is unique.
That's unique, and they're not doing that. The Chinese investment isn't happening like that in other places.
And investment in Cuba from other countries is not the same model.
Gene?
Gene Rosenberg. My question is for the panel. Is there a Chinese-Cuban legacy here in Miami?
Yes, we have one of the most popular and enduring exhibitions at the Miami-Dade Freedom Tower of Cubans coming in is often one of the first ports of call for me. At the Cuban, I work at the Cuban Heritage Collection, and Gladys Gomez Rocio, who's there, is one of my work companions, and together we receive a lot of information from Chinese Cubans here in Miami looking for information. So it's scattered. It's not so much of a communal aspect, but for example, somebody that Gladys put me in touch with, he was a Pedro Pan child, but he eventually settled in Miami, and then he brought his Chinese-Cuban father, who is 100 years old, who still lives here in Coral Gables. So.
Please come forward so they can see you in the panel.
My name is Sonia. I've got a couple of questions. It's kind of personal. Because my grandfather came from China to Cuba, that's all I know. I never knew him. So is there like a ledger of like boats that came in with the names of the people on it? And also, I don't know if he's buried there, or I heard he was buried, but since it's come to think that sometimes boats were repatriated back to China, how would I go about finding out, when he came to Cuba?
So,
and
I think,
whoever can answer the question.
yeah, I don't know that I can answer for sure, but as far as a ledger, it would be, the best bet would be through this overarching association that Martin showed, the Casino Zhonghua, that keeps records of any Chinese who was a member. And probably your grandfather was one of these early 20th century migrants, not necessarily part of the indentured labor trade, which really that trade is ended by 1877. So Chinese who came in the 20th century were different. They could come as free migrants and settle, and so they would have joined and been registered in the Casino Zhonghua, which the organization is also now taking it upon itself to trace the history of all of its membership and keep those records.
How
So-
would we get in contact with
You can contact myself and Martin after, and we can put you, dig up their emails, but they have email addresses. It's best if you know an individual, we can put you in touch with specific individuals that may know and can go look for you.
Okay.
And if you know, the other thing is the names have changed, right? Some people use false names, because this is the period that I was discussing where they may have come in under a different identity, they may have come in part of this labor program and then just slipped off the plantations, or they may have come in illegally and not been even documented. But eventually, if you have a name and even Chinese characters and a hometown, then that's more information to narrow it down by.
The very best place to start is Casino Chumwa, and then the other associations that not just operate in Havana but across the country, they are organized by last names, so the last name really does become quite crucial, and if you do know also some of the details of where the family might have come when they were from mainland China, well, probably not, but...
Oh, so if I knew that he came from Canton, that would be helpful. At least it was said.
Everything.
Yeah, usually Canton, it's the entire region of Guangdong province. So, yeah.
That's all I heard.
And there might be, this is the thing, when Maria first showed me her documents, she actually had the town there, not just Guangdong. So sometimes people miss that there's actually a village. That's how I was able to trace this back. Not only was the family in the same village, but the address was the same. They hadn't moved.
Thank you.
Yes?
My name is Kathy Perez. I'm interested in, do you have any information on how the Rocky Chino in Havana survived the revolution? I mean, all those years, under dictatorship, which largely, tried to do away with, that kind of grouping. Do you have any information about how that's, how many are left right now?
Hundreds.
Hundreds?
Of native born Chinese.
And they're still
A handful.
Yeah, so, how they...
And they're very old. The only thing I can really tell you is that at the worst part of the revolution, many of the associations were completely shut down for fear of literally trading with the enemy. So, many of the associations did go underground, but I think that the visceral Chinese presence and its mass, the population was too big to ignore or to shove away. And before the revolution, Chinatown had a very seedy atmosphere or connotations with drugs, with opium dens and vice. So it did go through an extensive cleansing period, and to get rid of what also was seen as not just Chinese but American influences, for this kind of black market. So I think once those were kind of moved away, it became more sanitized and in line with party rule.
And the biggest change was that they lost its membership, especially after 1968, the nationalization of small businesses. A lot of Chinese small business owners did flee and left for Miami and Union City. And so the people who are paying dues, who are supporting these ethnic associations, are no longer there. And so a lot of the records show that the association just dissolved because they didn't have enough dues. And then, of course, it's very parallel to what happened in the rest of Cuba, that there simply wasn't money to help and the initiative to restore and keep the buildings up. So a lot of it really fell into decay. I mean, that's true. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
My name is Jose Benke, and I'll say a little story, perhaps to fill the gaps on some of the questions that were asked. I'll start from the end and then work toward the beginning. We were at one point in our history, our family history, 20 first cousins from my father's side. My father was the son of my grandfather, of course, who was Chinese. And of those 20 first cousins, perhaps 9 remain in Cuba. And 11 of us came to the US. Of those 9, They largely stayed in Cuba because of family reasons. Their father passed away early, or the family broke apart, and largely the Chinese that you will find in Cuba today are remnants, like my family, that has remained there. Strangely, their children are now coming to the U.S. The historical setting for prior to the revolution is that there was a Chinese population in Cuba that in many ways had been fantastically successful. Here today, we didn't hear about that story, which is all right. The story of the Chinese in Cuba is very large. My dad was a lawyer, a very distinguished lawyer, and he was quite a businessman. My grandfather, who was Chinese, was able to create a fortune in Cuba to the extent that he went back to China with the Cuban Chinese family of, at the time, the first time that he went back to China, there were 8. And he was able to finance a trip of 8 members, family of 8 members back in the early 20th century. It's incredible to make a trip back in those days to the town of Cao. We are all from Cao. It's a small city north of Hong Kong in Shandy, I believe, in one of the slides that Ms. Lau showed, or I forget, it was Professor Lopez, yeah. And not only did he go with a family of 8, but they lived there for several years. They returned to Cuba, and he went back a couple of times until he passed away in the Great Famine. And the family history would be incredibly interesting, how he was able, as a young man, we have pictures of him as a young man with his long trencita, and become quite a businessman in our hometown of Colón. The Chinese imprint on Cuba was so large that in our hometown of Colón, which is a very small city in Cuba, in the province of Matanzas, perhaps 50,000 at the time, there was un casino chino. And this is a small city of perhaps at the time in the 1950 or 50,000. And there was a casino chino there that was quite a structure in just down the road from where we lived in the second part of the history. So I hope those fill some of the gaps, and it would be incredibly interesting, some of the stories of the Chinese Cuban businessmen who left such an imprint on Cuban society. I would like to end with the fact that in the team of a handful of lawyers that defended the aviators of the Cuban Republic Air Force who were tried, one of the lawyers was a Cuban Chinese by the name of Dr. Napoleon Seo, a dear friend that passed away. He published a book before his passing away, and he was a member of that team that defended those aviators. For your information, those aviators were all tried, and they were all found not guilty. Fidel intervened, and they were all sent to prison simply because they were aviators of the Cuban Republic. I met one recently, a couple of years ago. He had been in prison for over 20 years with his peers. Thank you.
Do you have any further questions?
Just had a quick question. question.
Quick question.
Did they experience the phenomenon where the language became sub-languages, like dialects that mixed, where then you eventually had an elderly who did not speak proper Cantonese or other Asian languages and also did not speak proper Cuban? That happens to us American Italians. Our grandparents, they don't speak Italian and they don't speak English. Does that happen there too? Or is that just strictly an American phenomenon where the language is lost?
Many of the elderly population of native Chinese, they hardly speak Spanish. So,
But they kept their proper
Cantonese.
native language, whereas our Italians did not. They actually forgot how to speak Italian, but then did not speak English very well either. That didn't happen then.
There was enough of a kind of Chinese bachelor community and these merchant communities where they could always speak Cantonese to each other, and then Spanish when engaging with Cubans, especially for business purposes. It's really the second generation that it gets lost.
That's phenomenal to me because the language changes every 30 years. So my grandmother who never spoke English at all. When we took her back to Italy 30 years later, her strict pure Italian was then an outdated language. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah. Possibly.
So I'm sure maybe it might happen.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
that's interesting. Thank you.
We have another question?
Yeah, you mentioned that, your focus is on the Chinese, but during your research, did you ever encounter any other Asian communities in Cuba that may have gone through the same process of struggle, within Cuba, of trying to maintain their history? Like, I know there were Japanese in Cuba as well, and other parts of Asia. Did you ever encounter that in your research as well?
Well, do you know Jose from?
No, only Chinese in my case.
In his case. So in the case of Cuba, there were smaller populations of Koreans and of Japanese, especially the early 20th century. And actually a book was recently published in Cuba about people of South Asian descent. And so even small groups of Indians, because as we know, Indian indentured laborers are circulating throughout the Caribbean, mostly the British Caribbean. And the best research that's been done on that has come out of Cuba so far. And it's books published by Fundación Fernando Ortiz on these populations.
There was also quite a lot of Filipinos, and you mentioned the Japanese. In Sao Agravio, I did some of my work. They tried to establish a silkworm factory. They imported mulberry bushes and silkworms to make silk, but it didn't happen. But they did leave a legacy of ice cream.
But we have run out of time. This is a fascinating topic.